you so much for being here. Today we have a very exciting presentation and conversation on MSMEs through dual crises, and this includes Hurricane Dorian and the current pandemic in the islands of Abaco and Grand Bahama in the Bahamas. We have two wonderful speakers today, and I'll just start introducing them quickly. We have Edouard Pinder, who's the Recovery Project Coordinator in the Bahamas for the UNDP multi-country office in Jamaica, where she oversaw many projects following the impact of Hurricane Dorian and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. She has many years of experience focusing on the social sector services and policies, working in projects in over 30 countries for various UN and other multinational agencies. And then we have our second speaker, Matthew Aubrey is the Executive Director for the Organization for Responsible Governance, which is a Bahamian not-for-profit civic foundation that's committed to actionable solutions to some of the Bahamas' most vexing and long-standing issues. And this is also the organization that implemented the socioeconomic impact assessment in the Bahamas. He has many years of experience leading dynamic teams at award-winning not-for-profit organizations working towards equity and social justice. So welcome to the speakers and welcome to the audience. We will start with a quick overview of some of the main highlights of the socioeconomic impact assessment. We have an infographic ready that Farita's already shared on the screen. I'll hand it over to Matt to maybe just go over these main points. There's so much more to see than this, but these are just the basic highlights. And then we will take a step back and go over the context, the process, the challenges, etc. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to everyone for making the time. And thank you, Anila, and Arilda for organizing. We in the Bahamas, obviously, like everyone, have been struggling through the COVID pandemic, but not unlike other places, we also had very, very recently before that, the unprecedented level 5 Hurricane Dorian. And we had a lot of opportunity to gain international support and relief, and UNDP was one of those real strong partners. In the aftermath, there was also a focus on how do we identify and target the businesses within these communities, understanding how crucial they are. Just for context, the Bahamas is somewhat unique in the Caribbean in that it is it's an archipelago with a series of 700 islands and keys, but 16 of those populated. And that spreads across a tremendous amount of space. So the context in one island is not always the context in another. And there's challenges that happen within that space related to transportation, access, resource deployment, all of those things. So this was kind of the setup as it went. And Grand Bahama and Abaco were the two islands that were hit within this, that were significantly hit within this hurricane. It first hit Abaco and then moved on to hit Grand Bahama, and the process of recovery is unique to each context. But prior to Abaco, prior to Dorian rather, Abaco was a little bit more the more self-sufficient islands. It had a kind of a very entrepreneurial spirit and very much was kind of under its own steam, but smaller than Grand Bahama. Grand Bahama has about 45,000, and Abaco was the third largest of our islands in terms of population. It looked at so when the hurricane hit, in looking at trying to understand what the impact was, it was clear that there was a major impact on our business sectors. We lost power, we lost just immense devastation. And when we started to look at the study, what it came out was it validated that a significant amount of our MSCs in those islands were damaged. So when you look at then not only what was hit in hurricane, it was also then what was further compounded within Dorian. So the study started looking initially at Dorian, but then obviously looked at what was the context. So that top line number is looking at the fact that the businesses across both of these islands, were over 63% were affected. Looking at that, many were totally destroyed. Many had to relocate. Many had to relocate to other islands even. And so when trying to understand what that looked like, we had to go a little further into the data. One of the things, and we'll talk a little bit more about this going forward, was challenging, is gathering data on our micro, small, and mid-sized businesses has been somewhat limiting. The scheme by which we have to set up and gather information targets ongoingly VAT value add tax revenue as a means to gather updated information, but it really looks at businesses, the way the scheme is set up, that make more than 100,000. So there's a large proportion of our small businesses, micro businesses, that aren't captured in that. And so when we went back to try and make an assessment, it was challenging to get access to that information. And so when we came out with this, there is a kind of an understanding, a caveat, that we were going into spaces where people were still reeling and trying to come out of whatever they'd gone through between these two crises, many of whom relocated. So finding and getting these folks was of paramount important to us. We did a lot of outreach in that way, but we can say from the groups that responded, though, and I think that they are relatively representative, that we're looking at a double hit that hit the majority of our businesses in these islands. Only 23% can say that they were affected exclusively by Hurricane Dorian, that COVID didn't have the impact. I think a lot of those are going to be food related, and those that are dealing with provisions, because they, in COVID times, construction, rebuilding, they were able to somewhat proceed. There's only 6% that speak about being affected by COVID exclusively. So it's a very small percentage that came through Hurricane Dorian unscathed, and only a small percent that said, 7% that said they were unaffected by neither of the events. The next line, obviously, you can see what that impact is that 27% of these businesses were permanently closed, 30% had to temporarily close, and then 40% talk about operating partially. So there's no way that doesn't have a significant impact on the overall economy of these islands, the availability of jobs, the availability of resources, and that I think is a telling thing, and we still see the impact of that. There also was a lot of support that came in. As I said, a lot of NGOs internationally, a lot of individuals, and even government. Then government stepped up with multiple opportunities of how to prop up businesses, making no or low cost loans available to keep employees on staff, putting grants out into the community for different areas and different reasons, but it was a limited amount who talk about having access to support. So of all the businesses that were affected, you're only either government or NGO support or other types of support. Only about 50% speak to the fact that they were able to access those supports. So there's a big area that didn't get connected. Only 22% or almost 22% in Grand Bahama had access to NGO support, although there were lots of different resources that were out there. And only 22.9% in Abaco. What was also noted by a lot of the NGOs there is that there was significant potential overlap for who got access to the supports. With a noted vulnerability, a lot of these businesses, we're talking, a significant percentage that did not have formal record keeping. A lot who were one or two people in their businesses. They didn't have the capacity in many ways, either being relocated or not having access to power and those types of things, to be able to take advantage of some of the support. And others reported that they just didn't know that there was support available. So there was of the amount that was put out, the significant amount of money that was put out. What you're seeing is that there was a smaller proportion that were able to access that. And so the effectiveness of those support, which was targeted at direct relief, it was also targeted at recovery, did not really get to the most vulnerable. What we also came out of this to understand is that there was a significant portion of informal businesses in these communities. They didn't identify themselves as formal businesses. They might have been a person that has something that they do on the weekends, a little side gig, as they call it here in the Bahamas. And that information remains uncaptured. It was estimated by the IDB that it could be as high as 30% of our economy is met and managed through these informal businesses. But as they were not formal, most of the access that we required, most of the ability to access funding or support required some minimal component of formalization. And as they were not, and many of them being some of the most vulnerable folks, these are businesses that would operate informally in some of our migrant communities. These were businesses that would be the difference between someone being able to make their monthly bills from the difference between just their salary. So those folks were not able to take advantage of this. And similarly, we didn't have full understanding and still don't necessarily have full understanding of that group. So in the interest of how do we make sure that those that are most vulnerable are not only better in disaster preparedness, able to access relief when necessary, and then be part of recovery efforts, I think there's something we need to target here in the Bahamas. And this study, I think, highlighted that. There was also a further analysis of the data that we gathered through the UNDP Surge team. So Anila, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, but I think it highlights the target.
That's great. Thank you, Matt. That's a great introduction to the project and the key highlights. I was wondering if Edwal could come in for a second while we take a step back and describe a little bit what was generally happening at the outset of COVID-19 in the Bahamas, especially considering the impact of Hurricane Dorian in 2019. What was the situation like on the ground?
Well, Anila, and I think, and thank you, Matt, so much for providing all of the numbers and the data there. But yeah, if we do take that step back, so September 1st, 2019 was when Dorian began its 3-day-long impact here in the country. And it really was a unique storm. The Bahamas has been hit by many storms. I don't want to say we're a nonchalant population when it comes to storm prep, but everybody's been through a Cat 3 storm, a Cat 4 storm. It really was not expected what the end result was, and it really was. I'm sure I think I've seen some of the other countries in here. I'm sure you've gone through this level, whether it's been the tsunami or that event, life-changing event, and that was Dorian for the Bahamas. Abaco still had no electricity in 80% of the houses in June 2020, just to put it out there, and the Bahamas is a high income country. We're very different than a lot of the countries that UNDP works in that our per capita income over $20,000 per person per year. We are generally well off. We have good infrastructure. So Dorian's impact was both unprecedented from the global level. It was the strongest storm on record for that length of time in the Atlantic, but also in what it did here. Then we move forward, all the things that Matt's already described about its impact on businesses, and not just on an infrastructure level, but on the human resource level. So even if the business maybe had its building survive, the individuals who worked there, they lost their homes. So they had to relocate. So even if it was a viable business to work following the storm, there was no way. There was no running water. There was, as I said, no electricity. There was no telecommunications. So all of these things went on. And as Matt said, there was this really incredible response from UN agencies and the international donor community, NGOs. They came in. It was really remarkable. So all of these different groups were coming in to provide assistance. And then in mid-March is when we had our first COVID case, which I fondly look back on in retrospect, when the entire country was shut down and locked down. You could not leave your property because we had one COVID case. It's amazing how the world has changed since then. But yeah, we went into an incredibly severe, strict lockdown. No businesses were allowed to be open other than pharmacies and gas stations and food stores. And food stores were only on certain days. You could go based on the first letter of your last name. We had all of those types of setups going on. And what I discussed with the UNDP multi-country office was, look, we have this organization that's a unique public-private body, that it's an NGO, but it is funded through government, called the Small Business Development Center. And prior to Dorian, they were really there as an incubator to try and assist businesses in learning how to do business planning and getting their businesses structured better. And then following Dorian, they really took on the mantle of responsibility for trying to work out how to assist all of these, as Matt said, all of these devastated micro, small, and medium enterprises in Grand Bahama and Abaco. So we had this unique situation here in the Bahamas that it had been over 9 months since Dorian had hit, when then we got this double whammy. And the question was, what lessons had we maybe learned from the assistance that both NGOs and the government had provided following Dorian to micro, small, and medium enterprises that perhaps we could translate into economic recovery assistance for these enterprises now of that type, but throughout the entire nation, following what we could see were going to be the impacts of COVID. And so that was sort of the big picture, the context that led to this study being done in the way that it did, that it wasn't just looking at COVID, but also wanted to look at what had been the impacts of Dorian and what were the successful mechanisms that were utilized following Dorian by both NGOs and the public sector and the chambers of commerce, the full-on for-profit sector, to try and re-stimulate the economy in those areas. Noting that at this time, again, naively, I think we started talking about this study maybe July, August 2020. You know, we all thought that this was going to be great. This would be useful to move forward a little bit during COVID, which would end shortly. And obviously, as we're all in the midst of our Omicron peaks, or most of us are, it's let up on businesses, hasn't really receded in the way that we'd anticipated. And so that was still the big picture. So this is finally wrapping up. We faced a lot of challenges, as Matt said. Just for context for others out there, in the Bahamas, we don't have income tax. And so prior to the implementation of VAT 10 years ago now, Matt, maybe 2011, 2012, I think VAT was introduced here. Almost everybody from a big picture perspective that was a micro, small, or medium enterprise would have been considered informal by most international definitions. And it was really with the introduction of VAT that small businesses did start to come into the fold of that. But as Matt said, there were still so many that weren't eligible. Not only eligible for the assistance, but also really difficult to get data on and know how to best assist them with further crises moving forward. And informal businesses are the bulk of so many of our economies for the groups of the countries that I've seen already represented on this call. So I don't think this is a unique thing for the Bahamas. A tsunami hits, an earthquake hits, the NGOs come in, the government tries to assist, but the basic administrative requirements that are often in place to receive that assistance, if you are an informal business, are impossible to get over that hurdle. So I still think that's one of the big picture takeaways that came away from the study for us, is how do we ensure that these individuals, who are often the sole breadwinner in their households, and there's only them working on their small business, how do we assist them in these times of turmoil? So I think that was sort of my big picture contextualization for the project.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Etoile. I think something else that you mentioned that I thought was important was those gaps in data, that need for the socioeconomic impact assessment. You mentioned the gaps in data and understanding of the micro, small, medium enterprises, the unique context that Matthew mentioned between Abaco and the Grand Bahama, the lack of data on informal businesses specifically, and the data on the impact of Dorian on those businesses. So I think this was a good piece of information on the key information needs and gaps that really drove the need for this project. I was wondering, for those in the call that maybe are not very familiar with the SIAs in general or the context in the Bahamas, could one of you go through maybe the main steps? How was the SIA done? Who did you work with? Who did you partner with? How was it actually deployed on the ground?
Thank you. Just a quick highlight what Etwal pointed out. Not only was it the formal businesses that I think we struggled with, but the informal business, but even the formal businesses, a significant portion, about almost 40%, indicated that they were not necessarily aware or saw a real benefit for the registration. So even at that point, what we have is a struggle for them to understand why being formal can access that. And this didn't necessarily reinforce the value to say that if you're formalized, you can access support, you can access resources. When we undertook the socioeconomic assessment, impact assessment rather, we started, obviously, we partnered with UNDP. Surge came aboard as a critical partner to us, helping us to kind of better understand COBO and understanding what are some of the best mechanisms to go forward, as well as then offering to ultimately do a multi-analysis of the vulnerability. We worked and partnered to some degree with the Small Business Developing Center. The challenge becomes with that group is that, as Etwal said, they did a brilliant job pivoting from being an incubator model, identifying new businesses and encouraging entrepreneurs to come forward, to then having to be an anchor for the dissemination of a lot of resources and funding. And that wasn't what their original design was. And to their credit, they were able to do that and pivot, but it didn't allow for them to really deal with and manage the data that they had achieved or received through the process. So they were still trying to, and of course, they're still working on Dorian when COVID happens. And that's, again, another portfolio of things they have to work on. So they were willing partners, but access for them was a little bit tough to gather access to information. Similarly, we worked with government, and that's another challenge. What both Dorian and COVID have highlighted have been infrastructure issues that have been longstanding in the Bahamas. We weren't prepared prior to this, and so it manifested here. So accessing data about this population was tough. So it took a lot of back and forth. We then also, as we then started to deploy the survey tool, we partnered with local chambers of commerce. We had folks that were on the ground in both islands. We started doing things like call centers and disseminating lots of media partnership that we got to get the word out. We had multiple media placements and talking about it and stories in the newspaper. And still that became tough in a space like Abaco, where the infrastructure was just devastated. Radios and TV and newspaper things didn't really work. So we ended up having to go door to door, or in some instances have folks that were just camped out in places where people congregated to try and catch them as they came. We were able to offer incentives to try and get people to support. So we really had to scramble. But the chambers of commerce were partners. The local businesses that had a little bit more capacity to be above the day-to-day, were able to reach out and support and push it into their networks. But it was really a one by one kind of thing that didn't come back quickly, and so it required longer time than I think we were initially intending. And our resources had to be deployed in a way that was not necessarily the original model. But it was great to see and important that people were interested in this information. They wanted to know, and they wanted to be a part of it, to help us to identify what could be done better in the future. So that was kind of the story, which was, I think, positive, because we still see benefits coming from that. The Abaco Chamber of Commerce and our group have been working together pretty closely, and we're helping them to build out an economic development council to specifically target how are things done there. One of our challenges in the Bahamas is we tend to have a much more centralized model, We do have some local government and dissemination, but most things are hubbed out of our capital island of New Providence, which doesn't necessarily have the best understanding of what the needs might be in each of these different islands. So to see that there's some specific development in each of these islands that's happening, that's looking at how they chart their own way, I think is important. So that's kind of the who all's been involved.
Great.
And
Thank you, Matt.
I'm just gonna, Anila, I did just because I think there's one other bit there from what Matt had mentioned is we had a livelihoods working group going because of Hurricane Dorian. So we had already had with CORE, with World Central Kitchen, with UNICEF, with the Chambers of Commerce, there were these groups already, Samaritan's Purse, Mercy Corps, all of the big players were already in here and working together, which was both wonderful, but then on the other flip side of that was that almost every organization had done their own survey of micro, small, and medium enterprises to see where assistance could be best provided. So by the time we were doing ours, respondent fatigue was definitely a factor out there. And I do think it's still, it may not be written in our documentation, but I do think it's an important lesson learned following a disaster. And I would say it's probably the same for even if only you had COVID, right? Because it's been such a devastating disaster, but just really trying to get better synchronicity between the not-for-profit sector, groups like the Chambers of Commerce in your country, and groups like us as UNDP that then come in, because it was just repeated a lot by the MSMEs. Like, I've already told people this, like, I told you what my problems are. I told you why I went out of business. I told you what I need. And while they're grateful still, you know, when it's the third time that they're being asked very similar sorts of questions, I think it's also right, Matt, like this was then out there just as a barrier to then getting good data collection. So how can we as a leader like UNDP in this type of work with livelihoods come in early enough to be able to do better coordination on the data collection side of things, so that we're not sort of repressuring these individuals who are already under the most stressful times. Many of them, we didn't bring it up, but I mean, but the reality is, both with COVID and with Dorian, people were losing family members and losing their coworkers all the time, right? Like this was the harsh reality, is that death is also super integrated with this type of trauma that is going on. So not only do you have physical devastation, but you have people going through emotional loss as well. And it sort of felt a little bit like there was a little bit of emptiness from our side, not us particularly as UNDP, but as the community trying to assist, but not taking that sort of factor in. So just putting that out there.
And a bit of skepticism, I think, for people's belief that this information would generate. People in Abaco are still, wandering through and driving past mounds of waste that hasn't been removed. We're talking, 3 years later, and so it becomes a defeating environment, I think, and that also contributes to it. But I'm so sorry that I did fail to mention that. But yeah, the Livelihoods Working Group was actually one of our strongest and most vibrant partners. And I think also highlights a key need in spaces like the Bahamas. And when we talk about preparedness, there's a real importance in connecting and building out the networks of local NGOs. When the international NGOs came in, I mean, they were the big crux. UNDP came in and was in many ways was able to supplant what the government strategy and effort and response was, and create a hub where all the international NGOs could kind of come in, get information, set up clusters, do the things that you do really well are not inherent or built into the Bahamas or even part of our local NGO structure. So that was really a key component, and so access in that way was great for functional components, but in going back on archiving data or accessing structural components or getting government to respond, there's still some miles to go before we're there. So I think that's also an important kind of, building up the infrastructure initially is going to help us to have the impact when groups like UNDP and all these NGOs come in, because they'll not have to recreate it every single time.
Thank you, Matt and Etoile. Yeah, we're running out of time, so I'm just trying to wrap up some of the things that have been mentioned. So just highlighting the fact that there was a multidimensional vulnerability index analysis that was done. Those of you interested in seeing how it captured the many layers of vulnerability and enabled a nuanced analysis are able to find that in the report that was posted also in the chat. Some challenges were mentioned in terms of access to background data, government data not being necessarily comprehensive enough, information on informal and formal businesses not being up to date, participation in the survey garnering a slow response and having to come up with quick ways to widen that outreach. So some of the lessons learned there too. I was wondering if you guys have any concluding takeaways. I'm aware of some questions in the chat as well. I think we can answer them in the team space right after. So maybe let's just go with takeaways. What made this assessment worthwhile for both of you?
I think we kind of stated a little bit. It highlighted some structural things that need to be addressed, making sure that there is a focus on better understanding the sector, that vehicles like the SBDC, the Small Business Development Center, and the chambers have a dedicated focus on let's understand, let's look at how we can move more informal groups over to formal groups. Let's look at how we work with folks who've developed their businesses, because we're putting a lot of money into small business development right now, but we're not necessarily building in systems that are going to help them migrate and see the value of their registration, see the value of formalization, and then ultimately take benefit of the resources on preparing for disasters, as well as when those things happen, how to access recovery systems. So I think it's definitely demonstrated that, and I think becomes an opportunity for us to raise that with all our sectors. And then we're starting to see some traction on that.
Just would echo Matt. I think that the data that's being collected is now being taken on board by the Ministry of Finance, by the people that count, by other NGOs in large groups here, and really do hope that it can serve as a platform along with all of the other amazing analyses that have been going on in this context around the world from UNDP, but really making us more efficient. Again, my background originally is as an economist, and anytime we can make a dollar go further, it's a win for me. So actually putting the money where it needs to be, and as Matt said, showing the benefit to establishments on taking those 2 hours to fill in the forms they need to, but it can actually maintain their families' livelihoods, is the other key takeaway there. So thank you all for being here this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you so much, Etoile. And you touched upon another question that I had in my mind, not necessarily time to vocalize it, on the next steps and the outcomes and what's there to be done with the data that's been collected. So thank you for mentioning that. Thank you to both of you for being here and sharing your experience. Thank you to people here in the room for coming to listen in. We'll see you next month with another Search Data Hub Data Talk session. Have a great week. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.